All right, well, hello and welcome to the RIMS and ISRM Risk Leadership webinar. My name is Marina, and I'm the co-editor of Fem Insights and Security, which is a database for all women in all backgrounds of security. We'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today, as well as our brothers and sisters joining us from New Zealand. In this webinar, we discuss the psychology of risk when it comes to making the right decisions for your team and organization at a time when the world is volatile, uncertain, and ever-changing. We introduce a concept termed Presilience, the attribute and process of successfully overcoming major business interruption events and crises, while at the same time looking for opportunities. We'd like to begin by introducing our wonderful panelists joining us here today from both New Zealand and Australia. First up, we have Dr. Gav Schneider, the PSG Programme Convener, the Regional Chair of the Institute of Strategic Risk Management in both Australia and New Zealand, and the CEO of Risk to Solution Group. Dr. Gav Schneider is an acknowledged subject matter expert on human-centric and integrated risk management. He is the creator of a highly acclaimed Presilience approach, which integrates risk, leadership, and high performance to create great outcomes, and enabled his business to make the prestigious AFR Top 10 Most Innovative Companies for 2021. Welcome, Gav. We have, great to have you here. We have Kerry Baccaris, the president of the Risk Management Society for New Zealand and the Pacific Islands. Now, Kerry is the head of assurance for Sky City Entertainment Group, which is located in Auckland. Kerry was previously the risk manager for the county's Manuaku District Health Board, which is now known as Te Whatu Ora. She also worked for Deloitte and Ernst & Young for a total of 17 years, and she is very passionate about delivering value, driving equitable change, and also supporting individuals in growing and developing their career. Thank you for joining us, Kerry. We also have Gavin. It's great to have you. And we also have Gavin joining us from New Zealand today. And Gavin Pearce joined Te Pūtea Matua, which is also known as the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, as Director of Risk and Compliance in August 2022. But his career in risk management, management consulting, and actuarial roles, it spans nearly 30 years. So we're very happy to have your expertise here with us today. And he has worked in New Zealand and Australia for large general insurance companies, government entities, as well as consulting firms. Gavin has a master's degree in statistics from Waikato University and an MBA from Henley Management College. He's also a qualified actuary and a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Welcome all. Well, we'd like to begin today by providing some context on the risk management landscape, which will be provided to us by Dr. Gav. So, Dr. Gav, over to you.
Thanks, Marina. And it's a really wonderful opportunity to start talking about something that we are all very passionate about on this webinar today. And that's how do we enable better outcomes in a world that's changing so quickly around us? Part of the challenge we've got at the moment is that we are moving into uncharted territory. The internet has changed the way the world works. We're hyper-connected. The access to information is live time. We are realistically a global community, but then we're dealing with things like COVID that, really divided and locked down the world and showed the fragility of many of our systems, ongoing natural disasters, and our thoughts go out to our colleagues in New Zealand, who, it's interesting, normally it's the other way around, where we're having to deal with disasters and recovery in Australia, but New Zealand has had a rough run of late. And I think it's one of those things, climate change, no matter how we look at it, is a reality. And it's one of those challenges that any business has to start to factor into the way they think and perform. We've also moved into what people smarter than me are terming the fifth industrial revolution, which is really the time now where we're trying to figure out how do we get the best out of technology and humans. We've moved past the fourth industrial revolution, which was the integration of AI and robotics into the way we manufacture and do business. It's here to stay. The game has changed. So when we look at modern risk management and we look at the concept of risk leadership, realistically, from my perspective, we're not actually talking about risk anymore as a separate part of a business that's managed by a department, but rather we're talking about the way we all need to think, act, and make better decisions, and then how we can collectively integrate that to drive higher performance in a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous operating environment that certainly will continue to be this way for the foreseeable future. It's an interesting time to be in the world of risk management, and realistically, the attribute of risk leadership has probably never been more important. We need to enable general leaders who are making decisions, which is risk management all the time, and sometimes having to do it quickly with the right skills. But we also need to still serve as a balance between being too risk-seeking and being too risk-averse, because we know in the modern world those are realistically a very tough challenge. We also know that changes in the way we work, particularly brought on by COVID, have changed the dynamics of the way teams and organizations interact. And that puts significant challenges on things like culture and alignment. So in a fast-changing landscape, we have to think more than ever around how we tackle the human and process componentry aligned with the technology and the systems methodologies that we become very good at. It's not good enough just to be expert at risk quantification and put static values to things that we perceive we manage, because chances are by the time we've stopped penning whatever that quantification and treatment methodology was, the game's changed already. So it's a very dynamic world with lots of different changing pieces, and happy to explore that more as we move forward. Before I hand over, I would like to say a big thank you to RIMS New Zealand and Kerry for enabling this collaboration between the ISRM and RIMS. And it's a great example of how we need to be tackling some of these challenges. No association, no organization, no individual has all the answers. But if we can come together, we certainly can move things forward quicker than if we all stay in our silos and swim lanes. Thanks, Marina.
I'm very much thinking about New Zealand today as we sort of have this discussion as well. You talked about us coming together to begin to approach different ways to sort of, marry risk and psychology as well. I'd like to dig into that a little bit more and ask, what are the first steps to begin, integrating risk and psychology for an organization?
So I think this will be a big discussion, and I look very forward to hearing Kerry and Gavin's perspectives on this too. But realistically, if we look at the history and the evolution of modern day risk management, it was, and no offense to my insurance colleagues on the call, but it was really driven by the insurance sector originally as a way to try and figure out how we can prevent and minimize the need to pay claims. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's still an important driving methodology and one of the bases behind the way we apply this concept of Presilience, which we'll talk about later. The challenge we've got now is we're coming out of an era that was very, very focused on the system above the person. And the drive was, how do we build systems that are actually not dependent on individuals and can continue regardless of an individual's preferences, drivers, attitudes, behaviors, or skills. There's nothing wrong with that methodology, and anybody who's worked in a large organization knows how important that is, but it's not enough anymore. We need to figure out, how do we switch the human on? And experts, like Daniel Kahneman, for example, talk a lot about the way the brain works and the way the mind works when we look at decision making. And we know that realistically, most decisions are not based on facts and statistics and accurate data. They're based on cognitive biases and emotions. They're based on the way we feel at the time and our perceptions. And that's regardless of all the facts and figures we can put in front of people. So part of the challenge we've got now is we have the ability to enable technology to help us. So data analytics, for example, has never been more effective than it is today. Our ability to analyze big data is incredible. Despite that, we're still not really that good at overcoming human biases in terms of the way we get to drive good outcomes. So my view when we look at psychology and the psychology of risk is that we need to move away from a binary approach of process versus people or technology versus emotion. And we need to look at, how do we get the best from both? Having been fortunate enough to run a postgraduate program teaching the psychology of risk for the last 7 years, it's been a wonderful opportunity to talk with and meet and work with some really smart people who have been tackling this frustration in their organizations daily. And many times it's been this challenge of, how do we just shift the dial a little? How do we get more human engagement? How do we get better decision making to align with what in many cases might be tech-enabled, robust processes that are simply not used properly? As just one example, it's estimated that between 80 and 95% of cyber breaches are due to human error, human failure, or out-and-out human negligence. But we keep putting all our resources into technical solutions. So we've got to be thinking a little bit differently, and that starts with the psychology of risk. It starts with understanding how our own minds work. It starts with understanding how people we work with think and act, and then it starts with relating that back to the organization. And my firm hope is that over time, we can actually move to the scale where we look at this on a societal level and we make the way our societies function better, as opposed to repeating the same mistakes we might have historically done and expecting a different outcome. Lots more to it, but that probably sets a good platform.
Thank you. A lot more to delve into there. And Gavin and Kerry, I saw you both nodding when Gav was mentioning the investment in cyber rather than people. Do you have anything to add in that area, or perhaps any lessons learned in that sort of space?
Yeah, I think, I guess for me, I became an actuary because I enjoyed solving mathematical problems, and then realised that you throw people into those sorts of problems and they become a lot more complex. Hence why I jumped ship into risk management a number of years ago. And so, yes, I mean, there's the old saying that, you know, people are our greatest asset as well as our weakest link, and certainly in cybersecurity, you know, that they are both sides of that same coin. And so, yeah, I think because of that, you know, the complex nature of the world we live in, and you think about and look at now, you know, all of these phishing emails and the ways that the bad guys are trying to get in, you know, the technology won't necessarily pick it up because it will just look like an email. There's nothing untoward other than, you know, the call to action, and if someone misinterprets that and responds to it. So we do need to have people cognizant of those risks to know what to look out for. You know, I firmly believe that, you know, the human brain is still the best processor of disparate pieces of information. You know, a computer is still just a 0 and 1. And I think actually it was a presentation I went to at the Australian Catholic University a number of years ago, where there was a debate about AI versus HI, you know, artificial intelligence versus human intelligence. And the consensus at the end of that was, to Gav's point, you need both. You need the integration of the humans and the technology. You can't get one replacing the other.
Thank you so much, Gavin. Great point. Kerry, anything to add to that conversation?
I think only just to add that I think if you sort of look at the phishing exercises that organisations execute, anybody across the organisation at some stage gets caught out by them. So I think it doesn't talk to your skill, your level, your experience, your how many degrees you've got behind your name. The complexity of cyber crime these days is just it looks so real and authentic that actually it's really difficult to differentiate between what's real and what's not. And so I think it's easy to be caught out, actually.
Thank you, Kerry. And I'd like to follow up with you again on that point that it doesn't speak to skill. It's sort of more about having that risk awareness within the organisation. And I'd like to ask you, how can an organisation's leadership team actually develop a risk management culture?
So, I mean, when I was preparing for the session, you sort of look at the theory of it, and the theory of it is really developing a risk management framework, making sure that you've got a policy, making sure that you've assessed your risk, you've mitigated, you've got processes for people to escalate, and you've developed a risk culture. But from my experience, where organizations do it really, really well is there's a couple of things. The first one is that there's tone at the top. So the executive team have actually bought into the concept of risk management. They actually speak the language. There's consistency and frequency of conversations around risk management. Businesses embed risk management practices into decision-making processes. So where you're starting to do budgeting, you're doing capital allocations, these processes incorporate risk management processes and thinking into it as business as usual. Businesses have created a culture of openness, integrity, and transparency. So I think it's really, really important. This is the key one, really, because if it is that people don't feel that that they're empowered or that they have the opportunity to speak up, that really creates a culture of sort of not wanting to raise risk and have good conversations. So I think you can have the theory, you can have all the documents and the pieces of paper and have all the frameworks that you want, but unless it's actually embedded into process, into the business, that we've got a process for escalation, integrity, openness, transparency, it's not going to be successful.
Thank you. It sounds like a very difficult process to try and embed those values throughout the whole organization. And so I want to ask, maybe we'll start with you, Gav. I mean, any lessons learned from trying to create a risk management culture within R2S or ISRM?
Sure. So it's really interesting. With my academic hat on, it's really easy to go, well, there's a bunch of models and a bunch of frameworks, and we often talk about a toolbox approach. You build your toolbox, you rearrange your toolbox, and then you look at the outcome and you look at the problem or the opportunity, and you try and match those together. In practice, particularly because the topic of today is risk leadership, these opportunities present dynamically, and trust takes a lifetime to build and a second to destroy. And with that piece, I think Kerry mentioned a few things there around integrity, openness, and the way organizations conduct themselves. So I think it's a really, really simple decision that has to be made by all leaders today. And that is, do I want to have an organization that is able to adapt to things that change around me? Do I have an organization where people want to work and value working for us? And do we make the best possible decisions in the most appropriate time frame based on intelligence, not bias? If you've listened to that and you've gone tick, 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 that's what I want, then we're getting to the point where we're actually going, hold on a second, forget risk culture, we've got culture now evolving into something that's pragmatic and workable. And I can say with my consulting hat on, it's really hard to retrofit this into organizations that are probably more than 20 years old and are very used to bureaucratic ways of doing business. We've been very fortunate with our current business in that everything we provide in our consulting services, we do internally. And I can say the results are really, really good. And all the research shows, even if you're not a believer in risk management and you're not a people-centric leader and you believe in process over people, the return on getting the balance right is that we can gain significant productivity gains and that we can do so much more with less. And some of those metrics are so simple, something as simple as staff turnover. If people are happy and motivated, they don't leave. Therefore, my recruitment costs are lower. If people are happy and motivated and they buy into what we do, they're less likely to steal from us. So fraud becomes easier. They are less likely to be disruptive, which means it's easier to pull everybody in the same direction. So there are many, many tangible links. And some of the research shows that legitimately moving the cultural dial from a process-driven, process compliance above people attitude to a balanced approach can give you 50 to 100% more productivity. It's like doubling your workforce just by doing this better. And so it's not just a risk management discussion around, hey, there's so many risks we face in the modern world, we've got to do better at the way we tick the compliance box. It's a better way to do business in a fast-paced world because it gets us better outcomes. I'm sure Gavin Pearce has got a few comments on that one too.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Gav. Picking up both the point that Kerry made around that tone from the top, and the point that you made, Gav, about that, it's not risk culture, it is just the culture of an organisation. And certainly, in organisations I've worked for, I've strived to work on both of those elements. So, getting if you can, the chairman of the board, a board member, or the CEO to actually walk the talk, to articulate what it means to have a great culture with a, through a risk lens. I think the greatest example of that I had experienced was the chairman of the board of an entity I worked for in Australia that stood up in front of a town hall of all employees and said, in the pursuit of our objectives, it is okay to make a mistake. Just do it quickly, do it cheaply, and try not to make the same mistake twice. And that was completely unscripted. I didn't ask for it, but I certainly got a lot of mileage, just hanging every further conversation off that. And then, again, in entities I've worked with or for, really getting alongside your HR team or people and culture, whatever they're called, and talking to the culture of the organisation. Where are we taking it? How do I weave the risk elements into the cultural conversations, not go out and try and have a completely separate risk culture conversation or run a risk culture survey 2 weeks after the overall employee cultural survey. It just confuses everybody and it just doesn't work. And again, it's all about that holistic approach to, how do you win the hearts and minds of the employees in your organisation? And to Gav's point, if you do, that's the utopia. You nail it. People turn up to work, they know what the right thing is to do, they behave in the right way, reduces all those other unsavoury risks that Gav mentioned.
Thank you so much, Gavin. I mean, everyone sort of talked about how a good risk management culture is just the organizational culture itself and empowering everyone across all levels to feel free to be innovative and to make the right mistakes and low-cost mistakes. And Gavin, it seems like you almost found yourself a person in power or an influencer to sort of spread this message along the wider organization and wider group. I'd like to follow up on a question about that with you, and that is, how do we as organizations or even as a wider society sort of better manage and communicate risk in a way that all levels of an organization or different levels of a population sort of can understand as a whole?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think for me, the things that spring to mind is starting with your why. The old Simon Sinek approach is, you really understanding and articulating, why we are making decisions, having these conversations before you get to the what. I think so. That's the starter for me. And then in terms of delivering that message, I mean, I guess I look to our most recently departed Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, and I mean, she was, great in terms of that authenticity, that empathy, showing your whole self. And I guess I've seen the counter. I've seen some horrendous situations where people trying to talk to the masses, be that within their organisation or more broadly across a country, and having no authenticity about them, showing no empathy in terms of who might be impacted by or be the knock-on effects of these risk conversations. So that sort of, I guess, was part of the response to that question. I also sort of often say, bad news does not get better with time. So getting out early, having these conversations, and I think in New Zealand, we experienced the opposite end of that with the first set of floods, where we felt in Auckland there wasn't enough communication going on early. People didn't know what was going on. They weren't prepared for it. And then contrast that with the most recent cyclone that hit us just Monday, Tuesday, a lot more communication, a lot earlier. And so everyone was better prepared for what eventuated.
Thank you, Gavin. I think what we hear in that is presenting yourself authentically, which is something that a lot of people talk about nowadays, especially in the professional capacity, as well as daring to be transparent even when things are difficult or you come across an event that you'd rather people not know about. Gav, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Thanks. Just a quick comment on authentic leadership. And some of the buzzwords that fly around, if we take the risk component out and we just look at the field of leadership, there's a lot of things that are being done there. To be honest, I don't see any difference between risk leadership and leadership anyway, because a leader inevitably has to motivate, influence, drive decision-making, which all of those are attributes of risk and risk management. What we've found, though, and often when we talk about risk leadership, we're talking about stakeholders who work in a risk field, whether it's safety, whether it's security, whether it's cyber, whether it's finance and insurance, who then have to lead their own teams or lead those initiatives within an organization. And very often they are experts in one of those vocations, but not necessarily trained to be human-centric leaders. And I think that's the gap that I've found is one of the missing secret pieces to getting this high performance and aligned culture that both Kerry and Gavin spoke about. So this is a risk conversation, so let's just talk about it. There are significant risks with being authentic. Not everyone's going to like you. And I think we've got to be careful with that too, that a lot of times we are throwing around concepts like authenticity and transparency. If we take that to the far extreme, and I'm going to give you an example of a far extreme piece there, we're saying, hey, if I'm a paedophile, I'm being authentic and that's okay, which clearly for us is not okay and clearly a massive problem. So there are still, and for my risk colleagues on the call, we know these terms, we describe them within appetite and tolerance, and we have appetite and tolerance descriptors that enable us to say these are the required decisions, and we're quite good at that with tangible things like finance allocation. We're not so good at that when it comes to more of the intangible things like behavior. And I think we need to be very, very careful that authenticity and transparency are critically important, but they are also critically important to be delivered in lines with appetite and tolerance. And that's part of the leadership journey, is to set that appetite and tolerance for those aligned behaviors so we can all pull together to get great outcomes, and we don't land up celebrating outliers that potentially disrupt our culture, but we also create enough space for outliers who might be disruptive and innovative to bring their best selves to their job. So it's not a simple thing. And I think that's why so many organizations have ignored this aspect for a long time, because it's hard. It's much easier to have a policy, a framework, a set of procedures we run through, a binary numbering system, whether it's a 5x5 matrix or any other software system that we allocate values to risks, and then we manage them accordingly. It's much easier to do that than it is to actually go, hold on, let's understand our vision, our purpose, our objectives, look at our appetites and tolerances, and then build a capability from the top to the bottom to make great decisions aligned to that. That's tough. But when you get it, the returns are significant. And then probably my last point on that before handing over is that this is a journey, it's not a destination. And over the last 15 years of consulting with some really, really big clients, ranging from ASX top listed companies to federal government agencies, I've tended to found that when you talk to a client, and I'm putting my consulting hat on now, not my own business, when you talk to a client whose attitude is, we're all good, there's nothing to see here, we're the best there is, we've just had our independent audit report and it says we're excellent, so don't worry, those are usually the ones who are most vulnerable. There's nothing wrong with a bit of confidence in your organization to say we're good and we think we do stuff well, but we're always open to improve and we know things will change around us. So there is an aspect of humility, and we often talk about a learning culture, but back to Kerry's point earlier, that's a tone from the top thing. And Gavin made a really good point there around it's okay to make a mistake because that's how we learn what doesn't work. But if you make a mistake repeatedly, that's out of appetite and tolerance. So we've got lots of tools in conventional risk management that work so well with leadership and can just be magnified with an understanding of psychology and some of the other pieces. Thanks, Marina.
I'd like to add to that, if that's okay, Marina. So from my perspective, I think, and we've sort of alluded to it before, nobody's got all the answers. So when we're talking about how do we empower the nation and the population to make better decisions, growing our networks, I know, this is slightly sort of, different off topic, but growing our network, sharing information, and, for RIMS, one of the objectives that we have is how do we improve the risk maturity for organizations across New Zealand. And the way that we do that is through networking and sharing and education. And so I think individually, we should all look for opportunities where we can share. We all don't have the same answers, and we have opportunities to share across our networks, and we should be using those opportunities as much as we can.
Thanks so much, Kerry. That's a great point there. In terms of sort of moving forward and where we are in the context of a risk landscape right now, what do you, Kerry, see as a major risk at the moment? And perhaps how are they being managed, if it's a case example from your own life as well?
So I'm sorry, but I don't have only one risk.
Okay, yeah.
So I think from a New Zealand perspective, there's really three things that concern me at this point in time. The first one, from an individual point of view, is the cost of living crisis. I think, individuals are really, really struggling. Salaries are not keeping up. Food costs are going up, and families are being impacted. So that's going to have, a whole lot of impacts for businesses because, those are the people that work in your business. The second one, with all the cyclones, the floods, COVID, and just sort of inherently, New Zealand has a really, really high percentage of people that struggle with mental health issues, and the cyclone and the recent events are not going to be helping those. And so when it is that you start thinking about your risks and your climate change risk and the impacts to the business, actually you should be thinking more along the lines of, well, what is it going to be? What's the impact going to be to our people? Because chances are that's going to have a bigger impact than the actual physical impacts of climate change potentially to your business. And then the third one is really around the shortage of skills. So businesses have sort of, come up with a strategic plan, want to sort of execute on that, but actually we don't have the right number of people in New Zealand. We don't have the capacity, the skills to execute. And so businesses are really struggling to execute on their activities because we don't have enough people in country.
Thank you, Kerry. I just want to ask one follow-up question on that before expanding to Gavin and Gav. But around that, when it comes to the upcoming risks that businesses are facing and the education piece among that, do you think that organizations have a responsibility to sort of talk to their employees about what is coming up in their own lives in terms of cost of living or climate change impacts?
Definitely, I do think that they should. I think most organizations think about, well, what is the impact to the business? And then, so we've got a cyclone coming, and if there is a cyclone, then this is what you need to do to keep business operations going. But we don't necessarily go, okay, well, actually, you as an individual and you as a family unit, this is the information that we provide for you from the business as to what support we can provide, what you should be looking for, how do you protect yourself in your own lives. And so I think there is a big opportunity. And when you talk about, Gav, retaining people, the more that you sort of engage with your staff and the more you have good business relationships with your staff and support them, the better it is to retain and to keep people.
Thanks. Maybe just to add something to what Kerry highlighted there. Kerry, thank you. That was awesome because you summarized some really big picture ideas in only a few sentences, which is a really hard thing to do. But I think one of the things we often miss is we tend to talk a lot about the responsibility of the employer and the business, as opposed to the joint responsibility we all have to make things better for everyone. And one of the things that I think we have to start to change is this idea that it's the business or the government's responsibility to do X, Y, and Z only. Right? It's a combination of the responsibilities of those stakeholders and the individual. One of the problems we've got, though, is that in many cases, if an organization is way too process and compliance heavy in the way they apply their pieces, the human or the individual in the system can't be heard anyway. So there's a balance there. But there is a significant part that we have to acknowledge as an individual. If I work for an organization, I have responsibilities because I receive a salary, the organization pays me, or if I'm a citizen of a country, the old John F. Kennedy thing, ask not what you can do or what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. There's a point to that where we've got to bring that back too. And I think it's a really awkward and interesting balance that we're in now, where we are now in a societal norm across most first world countries, and Kerry's point about mental health is an interesting one, which we can circle back to, where we have this expectation of our needs being met, our wants being instantly addressed. We want instant gratification, we want instant support, and that's also not realistic. So one of the things we like to look at doing is, how do we build great outcomes at first and foremost the individual level? Because if I've got people working for me that are feeling unsafe, unheard, and don't have the non-technical skills, and I hate using that term because we tend to focus on hiring for technical skills, but most of the time people's career progression and their success in an organization is based on their non-technical capability. because the technical skills are just the baseline to enter. And in a fast-paced, changing environment where floods, COVID, economic hardships are coming at us, we need to be able to make sure that individuals can make the best possible decisions for themselves. And that's risk management, right, at an individual level. So we need to start there. Then we can look at teams, then organization, then societal. But it's a cascading and integrated approach. Is it easy? No. Has it been made more difficult by instant access to information and echo chambers due to information overload, social media, and some of the algorithms driven by search engines just telling us what we want to hear? It hasn't been made easier. But this is where us as risk leaders, and this is the call to action, I think Kerry highlighted it so well there, we've got a responsibility. And if we work in the world of risk and we understand these things, it's not something we can go, hey, culture is HR's problem, because it's all of our problem. And it transcends the workplace. It moves into society. So I think there's much risk for us, but there's equally so the upside of risk, which is opportunity, not just the downside. And one of the gifts that we get given through hard times is people build resilience, and they're able to deal with challenges better. The challenge we've got at the moment is if people are already starting from a broken platform, then we have the mental health challenges, and resilience is not even in question. Then people are just going to break, and that's not good for anyone. Thanks, Marina.
Yeah, great points, Gav. Gosh, and the question of top of major risks. I think to Kerry's point, there are just so many of them. And in fact, I've just recently, been reading about what they're calling a polycrisis. So the fact that we just don't have one crisis globally, we've got this multi-pronged kind of interplay between climate change, COVID or the COVID hangover, as it's called, and this sort of geopolitical instability and obviously conflict happening over in Europe, and then all the knock-on effects of that and the consequences for people both individually and collectively. To Gav's point, individual, tribe, sort of organisational, national level, and I think. To Gav's point, and certainly as a people leader, and you've got to think about the whole person. And I think, businesses, if they haven't already, and most of them are, thank goodness, you can't expect someone to turn up to work to do their job if they're worried about their friends, their whānau, because of floods, because of earthquakes, because, elderly relatives that it might catch COVID, those sorts of things. They will be the top risks for that individual. They're absolutely not work related, but to then expect the person to turn up and suddenly be able to switch all that off and turn their work brain on you're dreaming if you're taking that approach. And so I think it is that whole authenticity as a leader, and also helping the individual, through those situations, and to Gav's point, building that resilience, because the leadership followership has to be sort of considered an equal balance. I think gone are the days where people literally just turn up to work to swap time for dollars. That really doesn't happen terribly much these days. And so as a follower, you are expected to turn up and to come in with your ideas and things, and to be able to try new things and make mistakes, and all the things we've talked about previously with the cultural side of things. And then from a leadership perspective, is again, you've got to develop those individuals, their thinking, their resilience. If you don't, then I think, as someone once said, a leader without followers is just someone taking a walk. And so you do have to be considerate of and support your followers.
I love that quote. That was great. Thank you so much. And actually, please do use the Q&A panel to submit question, because I see that Nick has submitted a really great question that directly relates to just what we've been talking about. I'll read it out. He said, as humans, our perception of risk tends to be fluid in that it changes as a result of what's happening to us, a recent breach, a disaster event, etc. Within an organizational context, to what extent does instilling a risk culture involve being mindful of these changeable psychological factors? Great question, Nick. Thank you for submitting. Maybe, Gav, if we could begin with you. I mean, to what extent does instilling a risk culture involve being mindful of that?
Great question. Thanks, Nick. And that just gives us an awesome segue to go into the psychology of risk and Presilience componentry. I think part of the challenge we've got now is that we are not in a world run by fully automated AI and robots. So when we set solutions and structures up as though that is what's going to happen, to Gavin Pearce's point earlier, part of the challenge is the system doesn't work, things break. And then we keep getting frustrated because we've got remediations. Sometimes there's fines if you're in a highly regulated environment that might cause significant pain, or there's significant organizational reputational damage. So part of what we have to do is start looking at what are those things that enable great performance. And I think this is one of those challenges that it frustrates me so much when you see, whether it's safety or whether it's pure risk, when you see these vocational skills roll out as though they are simply tick and flick, follow the balancing balls processes that will get you a better outcome, and that the process is more important than the outcome. We've got that idea of risk theatre. We're just pretending we're actually doing risk management. We're not really doing it. We're doing stuff that makes us feel like we're being useful, but in actual fact, we're slowing the process down. We are putting extra steps in, and we've got compliance for compliance sake instead of compliance as an enabler. So I think there's a few important pieces there. Firstly, compliance is important because a regulation, a legislative act, anything like that has happened because some things have gone very, very wrong historically so many times that we actually have to make sure that this is done and that there's penalties for not doing it. I view compliance as the ticket to the game, right? If you can't even do the basic stuff, you shouldn't even be playing the game. Having come from South Africa and worked in about 16 different countries, I can say Australia is highly regulated compared to many other places, and compliance can be overwhelming. I was interviewed on a podcast not too long ago, and I was talking about this exact topic. And one of the interviewers said they'd just interviewed one of the leading financial sector risk and regulatory experts, and he mentioned that for a financial services business like a bank or an insurer to be operating in Australia, they have roughly 7,000 plus compliance requirements they need to meet. So just think about that. There's teams and teams of people just to tick the box, never mind culture or anything else. So there is a point where we have to be honest with ourselves that regulation doesn't make things better. Regulation can actually slow it down. But on the other hand, without it, we have chaos. So there's an important balance there. But realistically, the idea of instilling a risk culture around humans, not just process, from my perspective, it's a no-brainer. I sometimes often sit back and go, why do I even have to convince people to do this? Because if you're not doing it, things are going to break, your performance is terrible, and you're going to get disrupted. So I think both Kerry and Gavin earlier mentioned in different ways, authenticity, transparency, integrity, trust. These are all part of the risk management suite and part of the family of skills and tools we need. But they are not things that automatically happen. And particularly if you're in a diverse workforce with lots of different people who make decisions in lots of different ways, it's our job as risk leaders, and caveat again, when I'm saying risk leaders, I'm saying leader. It doesn't really matter whether you're the CEO, COO. It's our job to develop that capability in our people. And that requires a few things. One, it requires initial education. Two, it requires mentoring, coaching, and support. And three, it requires the ability to actually see these things through. Cultural change is really hard. I mean, we found it takes 3 to 5 years to change embedded cultural norms within an organization to get them sticky. That's a long commitment. And in a work cycle where people are usually only in jobs for 2 to 3 years before they change, it's exceptionally difficult to make that happen. But we do have to pivot. We have to change the way we think about opportunity and threat. We have to change the way we think about compliance and risk. And we have to change the way we look at risk in general as not just a downside negative thing that has to be done, but risk is how we achieve our objectives. And if our objectives are not things that are risky and you're playing it too safe, you'll probably get disrupted. So it's not a binary thing. But Nick, to directly answer your question from my perspective, human enablement is a critical component, and we can only build that through developing human skills that align to process, policy, procedure, and systems, and vice versa. Build policy, procedure, and systems that align to the way humans work, not just the way we wish they worked. Thanks, Marina.
I add to that? Just a quick statement. So it's a really interesting question because prior to working at Sky City, I was obviously at County's Manukau District Health Board. And so as part of risk reporting, I would summarize and contextualize the global risk report in the context of County's Manukau. And so a couple of years ago, the risk of pandemic wasn't in the top 10. And so as part of my risk report, I had reported that actually we still had a risk of pandemic, and actually based on the impact of the demand on the front door, so the emergency department, we possibly wouldn't be able to cope in that scenario based on our current capacity constraints. And so it was interesting sort of to reflect on the fact that, as you sort of say, it's this recent event that changes your perception and your prioritization of activity, because now pandemic is in the top 10 kind of concept. But one of the things that I think is really important when you've had a recent event is when you're starting to talk about risk, making sure that you've got a variety of people sitting around the table, so that you've got a variety of perspectives, experience, and skills. And so hopefully you have a balanced conversation and people can sort of work past the recent event and think broader and more to the future and more to sort of strategic intent. That's it from me. Cheers.
Just from my perspective, I guess when I read this question, and thanks Nick for it, it reminds me of the long list of cognitive biases that we talked about and discussed in the Psychology of Risk course. And so this is a classic example of recency bias. And I think our job as the risk managers is to turn those unconscious biases and bring them into people's consciousness, and to sort of, I guess, delve deeper into the questions behind. And a classic was, in a risk workshop, and you're trying to put a dot on a heat map or quantify a risk into a likelihood and consequence. If you asked about where would you consider putting terrorist attack, after 9/11. It was off the charts. But, asking the question about, well, actually, could that ever happen? Well, why do you think it's off the charts? And so they come back to, well, based on what's recently happened in New York, this is what we think would be. But I guess challenging those sorts of outputs and sort of saying, well, actually, could this happen in New Zealand? Could it even happen again in the US, given that it's already happened the first time? What else might we consider? And so it is taking the unconscious into a conscious conversation, I think, is one of the ways I would look to address the challenge that you're talking about in your question.
Thank you very much, all. I see we have another question from the audience from someone named Shane. So Shane asks, or he states, we can read and understand Thinking Fast and Slow, a book referenced by Gav, but knowing and understanding is one thing, but how do we actually influence? Are there 2 to 3 things that we can do in order to influence? Kerry, could I pass that over to you first?
I think from my perspective, the influencing part, risk management from my perspective is all about relationships. It doesn't matter what you've got from a documentation framework perspective. If it is that you can't build relationships within your organization, that's the starting point of your problem, right? So the first one is building relationships and then really understanding the objectives of that particular business unit and what it is that's important to that individual, so that you can have a conversation about, how do I support you to achieve your objectives? And risk management is only a process, a conversation to support business objectives. And so trying to find the commonality in the conversation using simple terms, using not risk terminology and definitions, but really having a conversation where it has an impact on the individual within the organization.
Can I jump in there? Kerry, that's awesome, because you can see you've lived that. And I think this is one of those pieces often we forget, that we're humans and humans get the best out of each other when we establish trust, and that's a relationship. But to directly answer Shane's question, Shane, if you're in New Zealand, ISRM and RIMS are putting together a masterclass and series of workshops towards the end of March, which we'll talk about. We're going to address this and cover some skills and techniques and approaches that will answer that question exactly then. We also have education programs like our Presilience skills program or grad cert in risk resilience and reliability. But just a few things to take away right now. The first piece that we need to think about is change is hard. And if we want to influence, we have to build a platform to influence from. So lots of little things cumulatively add up to you having the ability to influence. So if we look at, for example, the work of Dr. Robert Cialdini, the godfather of modern influence, as he's often called, there are principles, things that we can apply that make it better. So my first point is check out Cialdini's work. Yeah, he's done a lot of work on that. But I think it's also important to remember that if it's something that's worth changing, improving, adjusting, very often people will have a sunk cost bias or an historical leaning towards keeping it the way it is. And unless there's a massively pressing agenda driven from the top, the way you would drive that change is through influence by nudging. Slow, consistent, numerous steps in lots of different ways to create changes in perspective. The next piece with that too is influence is not just about the job title you have, the way you dress, the way you look, and the way you speak. It's about the qualifications you have, the credentials you have behind you, the people who back what you say. Honestly, that's one of the big benefits of associations, that you can talk to like-minded people. You also can get credentials. And I think that's what's one of the exciting pieces for me in the way the ISRM ANZ is collaborating with RIMS ANZ, is that it's not about whose association you belong to. It's about how do we come together to give our members more tools, more skills, more capability so they can influence and drive change. So probably that's my last point, is that you're not alone in this journey. And when you feel alone, it's hard. So that's one of the things that we can help you with, is spreading the word and sharing tools. Thanks, Marina.
One of the lessons that I also learned in a prior organisation was understanding who your supporters are and who really supports the concept of risk management, and using those individuals to support and influence on your behalf too. And then also understanding who doesn't support and what ways you can do to influence those particular individuals, because the approach may be different for those individuals. And so making sure they're almost doing a bit of a personality assessment of the people, your stakeholders, of who needs to be influenced, and having a different approach based on whether they're a supporter or whether they're against risk management.
Yeah, my first response to the question was thinking about, not just reading one book and looking at risk management from one perspective, but trying, as Gav said, gaining other perspectives and at the risk of loading up your reading pile, looking at other elements of risk management, like Cialdini's 6 Principles of Influence, Simon Sinek's Starting with Why. And I think if you brought those 3 together, first thing is understanding why is it that you are trying to influence somebody. So if you feel that you need to, understanding why you're trying to do that, what is the purpose, what is the objective, and sharing that with the individual, and then working, as Gav said, on some of the various techniques and principles that exist and have been well documented around influencing, where it's nudging, those sorts of things. And also in equal measure, as both have articulated, reaching out to other like-minded people, sharing your thoughts and experiences. I mean, for me, when I first got into risk management, I think the greatest learnings I had was from talking to other people, because the reality is, as you've suggested, you can read things in a textbook, but talking to people who've got all the grey hair, all the wrinkles, all the scars from the years of having to try and put this into practice, better to learn from them and hopefully have fewer scars yourself.
Thank you all. I think those were really great points. And I just want to touch on a theme that I've and I'm sure others have seen emerge over the course of this discussion. This webinar is about risk leadership, but we've also talked about how some of the best policies are the one where you can sort of work on yourself and learn ways that you can sort of empower the risk management culture within your own organization. That's my takeaway from this webinar today, but I'd like to go down to our wonderful panelists who have contributed their time and expertise today, and hear what their takeaways were from the webinar today. Gav, can we begin with you?
Thanks, Marina. So my big takeaway is almost always a thank you to you who have sat, listened, and shared questions. Knowledge that is not shared is not knowledge. Okay, and part of what we've got to do is we've got to come together to change the way we tackle some of these problems, because they're bigger than a company, they're bigger than a geographic segment, and realistically, they're bigger than a country. And we're not going to be able to solve these on our own. So in one small way, if it's just ISRM and RIMS collaborating, that's a good start. But we would really, really like to start changing the way we have these conversations so that we can elevate the discussion and we can share knowledge on what is working, as opposed to just do the same stuff over again and expect a different result. Thanks, Marina.
Yeah, and for me, I think my takeaway is that, it doesn't matter how much you think you know or how long you've been working in the risk management field. You can always learn something new. There's always, there are little nuggets that I've picked up from the conversation that we've had today, and I think for me it is that continued, coming to all of these discussions with an open mindset, because you'll always find something beneficial to take away. And obviously with Gav, thinking about Presilience and investigating that further, and also this collaboration between ISRM and RIMS, and continuing to see how that relationship grows and develops over time.
Thanks so much, Gavin. Kerry, over to you.
I think that the guys have summarized pretty well, actually, a good summary of the session. I think from my perspective, the takeaway is really sort of how do you incorporate and think about and really question whether you are making good decisions, and how you can improve that through understanding individuals, teams, and organizations, and how do you influence and change that. So that was pretty much my key takeaway. I wouldn't mind just talking about the upcoming sessions, if that's okay. So we're really pleased to partner with the Institute of Strategic Risk Management. Thank you, Gav and Gavin, for your time, for taking the for sharing your expertise and your skills and your knowledge, and your passion for risk management. So thank you very much. So we have two sessions on the 28th of March. Invitations are still to go out. The first in the morning is a 3-hour workshop led by Gav, and he'll be talking about the psychology of risk and risk leadership. That will be a roundtable discussion limited to risk officers, chief risk officers, senior risk leaders, and it'll be a by invite only. The second in the afternoon is a 3-speaker session. We've got KPMG, Gav talking about psychology of risk, KPMG talking about operational resilience, and we've got Sarah Baddeley from Martin Jenkins talking about modern slavery. So a really, really great opportunity again to further your knowledge and your education and connect with your peers in the sector. Thank you for that. Thank you for your time, guys.
Thank you so very much, everyone, and thank you to everyone who took the time to join us today. We really hope that you also have some takeaways to reflect on and take into practice going forward. And to join us over at the workshop in New Zealand that's coming up. If you'd like to learn more about the workshop, please feel free to email us at info@isrm.org.au. We'd like to close today, but thank you so very much to our panelists again, and thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.